My name's James Patton Rogers, and today I'm talking about the history of drones and how they came to dominate modern warfare.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. I'm Ian Johnson, Associate Professor in the Department of History and chairing the NDISC seminar series this semester. Quick announcement, our last seminar event of the semester will be on December 10th in a couple of weeks, and that will be featuring Susan Colburn, who will be joining us from Duke. It is now my pleasure to introduce James Patton Rogers, who is the Executive Director of the Cornell Brooks Tech Policy Institute at Cornell University. James is an expert on drone warfare, disruptive and emerging technologies, and the history of weapons and warfare. He is currently the NATO Country Director of the Full Spectrum Drone Warfare Project and has worked in a variety of policy roles over the course of his career, including addressing the UN Security Council and working with NATO and the British government. He's also a prominent public scholar. Some of you may be familiar. He was the host of a podcast, Warfare, which he paused only because of the arrival of his daughter about a year ago. That podcast averaged 640,000 monthly listeners by the end. Is that right? A very, very popular podcast on the history of warfare. He's here today, though, to speak about his recent book entitled Precision, A History of American Warfare, which was named one of the Independent's Books of the Month and is a really critical interrogation of the history of precision in American military history. So please join me in welcoming James to Notre Dame.
Thanks, Ian. Well, thank you all so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Johnson, for inviting me, and thank you all for turning up today to talk about what I think is perhaps one of the most important issues in international security at the moment, which is the rise and the global proliferation of drones. And specifically, in this talk today, given the audience, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the history of some of the origins of this moral, ethical, strategic ambition to achieve precision weapons and finally drones within American warfare, and how that went awry in terms of some of those moral and ethical ambitions to reduce the cost to civilian life, and how those drones have now spread around the world to at least 118 state actors, which I'll outline, and now pose threats back to the United States and its allies and civilian centers of those allies around the world at this moment in time. So it is a long history, but it won't be a long lecture. I think we've got about 30 to 45 minutes. I cover around 120 years or so in the book. It was an ambitious endeavor. I think I did it all right. But it also means we have an incredible amount of scope for questions. And so I want to leave lots of time for that, and also invite you to ask me questions on anything to do with drone warfare across air, land, and sea, both now and into the future. Now, my book was the first to track this history of precision warfare, which seems surprising given the prevalence of drones today, but I have been working on this topic for around 10 to 15 years. But it wasn't the first book to obviously write on this topic. When we think of the history of drones, we think of it as being an incredibly modern phenomena, something that perhaps emerges out of the revolution in military affairs, if we think that took place or not, and leads us into the wars in the Gulf, in Kosovo, and of course into the global war on terror, where the first drone strike was on October 7th, 2001, against Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban. Now, perhaps a foreboding of what was to come, that missed, but it certainly became a core aspect of the global war on terror. And we have had hundreds, if not thousands, of books written on drones, remote warfare, remote killings, and everything to do with drone technologies ever since. Now, at the other end of this history, there's also been quite a few books written about the origins of these precision technologies and of drones themselves, especially precision bombing doctrine, specifically on the Second World War use of precision bombing doctrine, something that I will touch upon today because I add some new characters and some new aspects and take it actually all the way back to 1917 and some of the reactions to the horrors and the brutality of the First World War. And again, there's been quite a lot of books written on this, be that Conrad Crane or Tammy Davis Biddle, Rhetoric versus Reality, some excellent works. What there hasn't been is a book that tries to bridge that gap between this seeming abandonment of precision, and we'll see why that took place, in 1945, and then it coming to dominate warfare from the 1990s onwards. And so that is the gap that I seek to fill with this book, taking us through some of the key nuclear strategists and nuclear technologies and ambitions during that Cold War that actually led to more investment in more precise nuclear weapons systems, and then that led to conventional precision missile technologies. And we'll talk about some of the strategic and moral ambitions that drove that and led us to this world of proliferated drones today. So, there's a lot of history to cover. Where on earth do we start? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to start where I started, in this intellectual and policy hinterland of all of us trying to understand what the Obama administration was doing, because I wrote my PhD during those heady Obama years that certainly feel an awful lot different to today. And we were contesting at that time with this promise that Obama had made to the American people. He was going to win the good war in Afghanistan and withdraw America from that illegal war, as it was called at the time, in Iraq. And he was going to do all of that while reducing the more geographical spread of American military deployments around the world. So as other terrorist organizations grew and rose in prominence in places like the Philippines or in Yemen or in Somalia, it wouldn't be increasing amounts of US troops that would be deployed to those places. Instead, he would start to rely on drones. Why did he make this promise to the American people? Well, by the time he came elected, you had at least 60% of American casualties that were as a result of the improvised explosive device. This was at a point where if you were deployed on the ground, you could no longer trust that ground you walked on, and you were slowed down to a snail's pace. And so drones were this panacea to the costs and risks of war, and they were his answer to the American people of how not to increase the risk to American military life. They would kill the bad guys, as was often the case, as said in policy speak, and save the good. Drones, to quote the president in his 2013 speech, drones are part of a just war, a war waged proportionately. Simply put, they save lives. Remember, Obama's a legal professor, an academic. He's deliberately drawing on the just war speak there in order to justify the use of drones. And there'd be Obama advisors at the time and policy spokesmen who would go on to say that drones remove risk from war, such as that pinpoint precision, that they reduce the risk to the civilians, and they also reduce the risk to American military lives. Now, we won't go into the debates about whether or not that was right. Human rights groups would certainly disagree that civilian casualties went into their thousands, and even when it came down to high-value targets, that those most prominent individuals were killed at least 4 times before being finally killed the final time. And of course, there were those who argue for a lot of the effectiveness of drones. We know from Nellie LaHood's work with the Osama bin Laden papers that Osama bin Laden was terrified and deeply frustrated by drones, and so were all of his key figures around the world who sought to spread al-Qaeda terrorism. It sought them to bunker down and not be anywhere near as effective. So there are 2 sides of the coin about whether or not drones were effective during this period and whether or not they continue to be effective in that counterterrorism role today. But for our story, it doesn't matter so much because they were incredibly enticing to a number of state and non-state actors around the world who wanted this godlike ability to strike deep from the blue and to kill their enemies at will anywhere in the world from thousands of kilometers away with very little risk to their own military personnel. And so this is what led me in my work into what I do today, which is analysing what we call the second drone age. So if the first drone age was dominated by this American monopoly over the use of drones and these somewhat truthful ambitions to reduce the loss of civilian life and to increase the precision and the proportionality of just war, of a just war, well, today they've certainly gone in a different direction. In fact, in my address to the UN Security Council that Professor Johnson mentioned, I argued that drones, once deemed to be this panacea for the protection of nations are now amongst the greatest threat to state security. It's a big claim to make, so let's put some figures, some numbers onto that. In 2010, 60 nations had a drone program. So that's not to say that 60 nations had acquired military drones, but they had the ambitions to do so. They were working on it. If we come through to today and my team's latest figures, we have 118 different countries that have military drones, weaponized drone systems. And we've got to the point where we have uncontrolled drone proliferation. Anybody who wants weaponized drones can have them. So that's around a 96% increase in just over a decade and a half, just under a decade and a half. And there's at least 65 armed groups out there that have the capabilities of deploying drones. Of course, likely more. Violent non-state actor groups don't usually declare what is in their arsenals until they use them against you, so that is most certainly a conservative figure. How are these precision weapons and drones used around the world today? Well, assassinations, short, medium, and long-range precision strikes, saturation attacks, sometimes they're called swarm attacks. They're not true swarms. We haven't got to that point in the technology where you can do that. So I call them saturation attacks or multi-drone deployments or rudimentary swarms. You can pick which one fits for you. And for intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance. And one thing that I'm super interested in the moment, and I'd be very happy to talk about, is the increasing misuse of these drone technologies that they've got hold of by state actors to target civilian groups, those groups who are perhaps ethnically or religiously not in line with the metropole and the ambitions of the nation state. And so we've seen a lot of indiscriminate use of drones against markets, weddings, religious festivals in places like Nigeria, Burkina Faso, DRC, Sudan. And I worry that drone mass killings and drone genocides with precision weapons are going to be a prominent feature of the future of war. Because while Obama might have wanted drones to pinpoint individual targets at points, drones merely guarantee death and destruction for those on the receiving end. Drones and precision weapons, precision just purely means destruction. And so that is what we're seeing around the world today. How else have they been used? Well, they've been used to strike US and allied military bases, diplomatic sites, critical infrastructure, and civilian maritime targets. And of course, they've been heavily relied upon by both sides in Ukraine, including through the Russian terror bombing of civilians and religious sites. We were just working on a paper, me and a colleague. At least 500 religious sites of different denominations have been targeted by Russia in Ukraine since the start of the war. So, that's the contemporary problems that I look into. And as Professor Johnson mentioned, I work with NATO and elements of the UN on that at this moment in time. But let's get back to the history. Because if this is the proliferated world of precision, where does this drive to achieve precision in war come from? And how has it been distorted over time? A cliffhanger while I take a sip of my coffee. Okay, so to understand this, we have to go back to the First World War, and perhaps actually a little bit earlier in the American experience. Because America hadn't fought a war like the First World War, of course, since 1865 and the Civil War. Instead, during that time, the 1823 Monroe Doctrine and later the 1904 Roosevelt Corollary had stated that the US would stay out of the brutal wars of the European Old World, and it would focus more on securing the continental bounds of the United States. So its force structure was set up for smaller policing interventions and bandit wars. So here we're talking about Cuba in 1906, Nicaragua in 1912, Haiti in 1915, and of course so many more that took place during this period. We also know that President Wilson is elected on the premise that he wouldn't take America into the First World War. That certainly isn't something he holds to, and the United States is dragged into that. A result of that is you have around 300,000 American casualties in that conflict, and the idea of a lost generation. There are protests in the streets in the United States in many major cities. I was in the New York Historical Society a few months ago, looking into the history of some of these protests and the pictures of thousands marching in the streets, including veterans, missing limbs. The call going out that the United States should never get involved in these type of bloody, muddy, brutal, entrenched battles in the future. So, With this in mind and the abhorrence of the general public, politicians start to look for ways in which the US might deploy force into the future if it's not going to deploy force in the way it just has. And there's a few early American air power thinkers, those as part of the US Army Air Service who had served in the First World War, who believe they have an answer. And the answer is the foundations of the US Air Force, as we see it today, the idea that you can go over and not through your enemy. They come up with this idea called industrial web theory. If you can invent the capability, so this is a technological solution to the horrors of war in the American experience, something that happens time and time again, of course, in the American experience. If you can invent precision weapons that allow you to strike with pinpoint precision against your enemy's industrial nodes, you can target the places where they make their bullets, where they build their weapons, where they build their tanks, where they process and refine their oil, where they make the rubber for their tires, then when you finally meet that enemy on the battlefield and you send your troops through, you won't have to face their Maxim guns on the lips of trenches because they won't have the bullets or the guns to fire. Instead, you pass through them far easily and at far less cost to your military personnel. There's also an added bonus of this. If you can strike with that pinpoint precision, you need less munitions, you need less sorties to fly over your enemy, but you can also, and this was integral to industrial web theory, you can also avoid the populace and their livelihoods. This is demonstrably different to how the Europeans were looking to bomb during the Second World War. Of course, we think about area bombing, carpet bombing, and most specifically, morale bombing. Bombing the morale of one's enemy, bombing the civilians to the point where they force their politicians to end the war. So, this becomes incredibly politically popular. It's something that the politicians can sell to the public, and so what do? Well, you invest in these people and you invest in these technologies. It was Colonel Edgar S. Gorell on the left-hand side there who helped orchestrate industrial web theory and precision bombing doctrine. And the chap on the right-hand side there is who would become General H.H. Arnold, the first general of an independent US Air Force. Taught to fly by the Wright brothers, his career stretches from the Wright flyer to the jet fighter, from the Wright flyer to intercontinental ballistic missiles. What a crazy age to live your life through in terms of technological innovation. But he didn't just live through it. I would argue he pushed and helped orchestrate the creation of those weapons, as we will see. Because one of the early weapons that he works on with Henry Ford and Charles Kettering is the Kettering bug. Now, this is the first drone in the American experience of war. It is set on rails. It has an early Sperry gyroscope on board. Its distance to target is set by the amount of revolutions that you spin the propeller, right? And it's kept on track by that Sperry gyroscope. Then, when the propeller cuts out over its target and it flies as the crow flies towards the target, dead straight, in theory, at least, once that propeller stops, a shock is released from the wings fall off, and it swoops down on its prey like a falcon. It doesn't. It was worse than useless. It would spin around in the air and it would come back and it would often bomb its own forces trying to test it. So it was never deployed in war. But again, for our story, that doesn't really matter so much because it was this early ambition to achieve not only these increased levels of precision in war. They were hoping this might be able to go 1,000 kilometers at some point. It never flew more than 100. Although still pretty impressive for the time. But it was also those first attempts to remove the human from that frontline fighting, to have these pilotless technologies that reduce that cost to American military lives and reduce potentially the cost to enemy civilians. And so all of this, the strategic thinking, the morality behind it in this progressive era and the technologies, well, they really inspire a whole new generation of American air power thinkers who worked really hard on this during the interwar period with vast amounts of money thrown at it from politicians to lead America into the Second World War, because it would be air power that would lead the charge for the United States in any future conflict. So how do they try and achieve this if the drones aren't working from that point onwards? Well, they have a second string to their plan, and this is to move away from uncrewed aerial systems, for now at least, and for a while at least, and to move towards crewed bomber planes with really precise, brand new analog computers on board that could help achieve that pinpoint bombing of the enemy. This one is called the Norden bombsight. Cost $1.1 billion. So that's half as much as the Manhattan Project, which doesn't sound like too much of a bargain to me, but it is most certainly an expensive system at around $23 billion in today's money. How does it work? Well, as the bomber approached its targets, the bombardier entered data about wind direction, airspeed, and altitude into the bombsight's analog computer, which calculated wind drift and provided the correct aim point. This worked perfectly during the interwar period. From around 20,000 feet, you could hit a mailbox on the corner. You could get a bomb in a pickle barrel. They were obsessed with getting bombs in pickle barrels. I don't know if that's an American thing, but it's a little bit weird. But they managed to do these sort of levels of precision because when you're flying over an Ohio or an Alabama in perfect blue sky conditions without the enemy firing at you, then you can calibrate these computers really well, and you can choose the exact point you want to release that bomb, and you can hit that target. This is most famously in a test against the USS Ostfriesland, and they sink a naval ship, mainly by targeting to the left and right of it and flooding it until it sinks. But still, it looks pretty impressive, and they get even more money to invest in this strategy. When it comes to wartime conditions in Europe, it's pretty cloudy where I come from. If you bomb the enemy, turns out it might make some fire, which makes smoke when you start to blow up buildings. Turns out the enemy might not want you to bomb them, so their flak is going to come up against you. And if you were under flak and you had to do some evasive maneuvers, your Norden bombsight wasn't particularly hardy. It would fall over and then take 10 minutes to recalibrate, if you wanted to recalibrate it and not just get the hell out of there. And so it actually became an incredibly imprecise bombsight. And so the Americans decided and tried really hard to try new tactics of deployment to make their precision bombing work. They would move towards daylight precision bombing so that they, and ever lower altitude as well, so they can make sure they hit these targets. And this, of course, led to a very large amount of American deaths from highly trained military personnel that were hard to replace, and also a lot of destruction of the planes themselves, and of course, the Norden bombsights. I think when their bombsight was used against Rouen-Sotteville, the largest train marshalling yard in Europe, 2 bombs hit within the bounds of the marshalling yard itself. The rest went off target and bombed the local town. And so you're being incredibly counterproductive when it comes down to how you want to bomb your enemy. You are ending up causing more civilian casualties by mistake. Winston Churchill would call in General Arnold and General Spaatz in order to tell them to stop this madness. They say they just need more time. Remember, they've invested so much money and energy in this over the interwar period that they really want to make this a success. It is deep down what they are, what they want to be, and it's enshrined within their moral and ethical approach to war. They don't want to turn to the British way of, in order to destroy something, you have to destroy everything. So again, they continue in the European theatre to try and make this work. The Americans bombing during the day, the Brits bombing at night. Churchill likes that because the Brits are at less risk and you can bomb for 24 hours, but it really doesn't work particularly well. And so by the time you move to Pacific Theatre, and in January 1945, they start to move towards area bombing. And in fact, more than that, General Arnold, who's in charge of all of this at this point, removes Hayward Hansell, who's one of these proponents of precision bombing, removes him from being in charge of the bombing of Japan, and puts in charge General Curtis LeMay, who is not a supporter of precision bombing. He's not someone who's been brought up through the interwar period to really push this idea. Instead, he really identifies more with the British and Bomber Harris and the idea that you can have area bombing of the enemy and it can be a great success. He, I would argue, pretends to try and experiment with precision bombing for the first couple of weeks, and then he starts to realize that you can actually use the Norden bombsight for something rather different. It's super useful at bombing precisely specific regions of cities, particularly regions of cities that could go up like a tinderbox. And so he uses this precision technology, the Norden bombsight, to strike areas of Tokyo and many other Japanese cities on a rolling basis. Remember, Japanese cities are made of paper and wood to cause the firebombing that we see that happens here. And in Tokyo alone, in March of 45, we have 180,000 dead in one night. So that's more than a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki that follows. And I guess in great irony, it's the Norden bomb site and one of the most experienced precision bombing pilots of the Second World War, Tibbets, who is used to drop the bomb on Hiroshima in August of 1945 from the Enola Gay. And actually, they're probably two of the most precise bombs, technically, dropped during the Second World War. You have the first bomb that is dropped on the Second Army base in Hiroshima within 500 meters of the designated target. And you have the second bomb in Nagasaki that's dropped on the Mitsubishi aircraft plant that again is dropped within around 500 yards of the target. They use the Norden bomb site to make that happen. They make sure that they rely on visual bombing. They're told to turn around if they can't see the target through the clouds. And so ironically, it is this technology, this precision weapons technology that is designed to reduce the cost to civilians in war that ends up being utilized for perhaps the most damaging bombing of civilians in history to this date. So, precision, you would think after this point, becomes a dirty word. And it gets abandoned as we move into that post-Cold War era, post-Second World War era, and into the Cold War. Why would you possibly seek to continue with something that not only didn't work, but was incredibly expensive and incredibly counterproductive? Well, it turns out that you believe some of the post-war accounts of your enemy who is in prison under your control, and I would argue might want to tell you what you want to hear. So you have Spaatz, who is General Arnold's right-hand man, who interviews Hermann Goering while he's in prison before he kills himself. And he tells Spaatz that it was the American precision bombing that was far more powerful than the British area bombing, and that they should continue along that line. There is also some data, to be fair, in the US Strategic Bombing Survey that turns out that maybe American precision bombing towards the end of that European theatre was a little bit more effective and accurate than perhaps they first thought. And so, all these thinkers don't disappear from 1945 onwards. You don't have a new guard that comes in the early days of the Cold War. Instead, it's the same people. General Arnold becomes the head of an independent US Air Force later on. And of course, he's the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at this period. And while President Truman is trying to create the United Nations and put the bomb in control of that organization, while a Einstein, an Oppenheimer, a Szilard are pushing for the idea of being one world or none at all, the idea of the atomic bomb being put into international control, General Arnold says, fine, work on your ideas of international control. I'll subscribe to that if you can make it happen. But in the meantime, I'm going to work on my idea of precision bombing with nuclear weapons. And although Truman doesn't approve it, General Arnold starts to state to his officers to start creating early nuclear war plans. So War Plan Pincher, War Plan Broiler, War Plan Off Tackle are all about trying to create a future American nuclear strategy where you can drop nuclear weapons with precision, because the argument being that if you drop a nuclear bomb, you don't want to drop endless amounts of them, you don't have too many of them, and you also want to control the escalatory effects of it, and so that's where we get the origins of this. Now, in the hopes that this would continue to be something that is worked on post his retirement, and actually his very soon untimely death, General Arnold, supported by General Curtis LeMay, although that would change, he established the RAND Corporation with a $10 million endowment from the US Air Force in order to keep hold of the civilian expertise that could try and make some of these precision technologies work and help develop precision strategies. These are the origins of this behemoth of the RAND Corporation, the think tank that we see today. However, what it creates in this post-Arnold world is a fight between these civilian thinkers and engineers at the RAND Corporation and those who seek to go in a very different direction in the US Air Force. So here's a little bit of a history of RAND and some of the key thinkers that I touch upon in my work. RAND, a valuable batch of brains, as it was promoted in the press post-Second World War. And that was the point. Keep hold of these civilians that helped us win World War II so we could win the Cold War. Bring in the top mathematicians and engineers in order to make the technical progress that we needed. They specifically focused on, within 3 weeks of establishing RAND, creating a world-circling spaceship. I don't think I need to be too obvious about what the military applications of such technologies might be. And they also had the social sciences branch that sought to take on the strategists and have top secret clearance in order to be able to have access to all the developments and keep some elements of the US Air Force in check. So from left to right, you have William Kaufman, who's one of the protégés of Bernard Brodie, one of the foundational nuclear strategists. Then you have Roberta Wohlstetter, who writes a lot about surprise attacks on the United States, especially about Pearl Harbor, and her work is actually used later on to try and assess how 9/11 came to happen as a surprise attack. Her husband, Albert Wohlstetter, who she actually got hired, who would be the core, he's the reason why he's in the middle, he would be the core architect of developing conventional precision strategies in the future. Deirdre Henderson on the right-hand side, who worked for the Kennedy administration and would bring a lot of these thinkers in to the White House to take on the extremes of the previous Eisenhower period, and Alan Enthoven, who alongside Kaufman here would actually also be brought into the Kennedy administration. So that's all the way up until the 1960s when these key thinkers who are working on these precision ideas are brought into power. But they have a long fight until they get there, because when Arnold leaves his military position and dies, it's General Curtis LeMay, that chap who had led all of the area bombing of Japanese cities, who rises very quickly in a meteoric rise within the US Air Force. He starts within Strategic Air Command, which is the part of the US Air Force that is in charge of that offensive capability with American nuclear weapons, and he rises up to being the head of the US Air Force. During this period, and bear in mind, to be fair on LeMay, he had led those precision bombing campaigns in the European theater. He'd seen how they'd gone wrong, and the Soviets got the bomb at least 5 years earlier than the Americans thought they were going to. So when he did come to power, he said, we just don't have the technical capabilities to achieve the precision to allow for counterforce that you want to happen. We don't have the technical capabilities to have a restricted nuclear war to avoid these civilian centers and just target military targets. And so I'm going to go in a very different direction. And he came up with something called massive retaliation that goes through in the Eisenhower administration. It's all built on the ideas of counter value. As I mentioned before, there's no investment here in the precision technologies. Instead, there is investment in as many nuclear weapons as you can get. And we get to a point in PSYOP 62 through into the late 1950s, where 3,200 nuclear weapons will be sent in a single blunt, full-forced attack against 1,060 targets in the Sino-Soviet bloc, as it was called at the time, so China and Russia and the rest, with 216 million dead, 4 million of those being across Western Europe because of the sweeping fires. So in my book, I argue that we deviated slightly from the precision ethos at this moment in time. There are some major fallouts with the RAND researchers during this period. There's one where William Kaufman, the chap on the left-hand side there, is having a meeting with General Curtis LeMay's deputy, General Powers, and General Powers states to him, if there's two of us left and one of them, we win the war. And Kaufman turns and said, well, you best hope they're a man and a woman to repopulate. I mean, the winning of a nuclear war is down to two being left alive and one of them. And there are many other more obscene stories to tell that I state in the book. And so we have that age of nuclear extremes in the hottest days of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is to sneeze in the wrong way or perhaps be deemed to be preparing its nuclear weapons, then you will have this massive retaliation response against the Soviet Union. And that's all about trying to deter nuclear war and deter the Soviets from ever thinking that they could, of course, deploy those weapon systems. Now, all of this begins to change when you have that incredibly close election between Kennedy and Nixon, one of the closest in US history, right? What's fascinating about that is it is Deirdre Henderson, who is shaking hands with President Kennedy there, who is sent by JFK to California, where the RAND Corporation is, to find people that could be part of his brain trust to help him to create national security policy that would help him win the election. Now, one thing that Curtis LeMay had done when they started getting fights with those from the RAND Corporation was remove their clearance. So they were dealing with old data. And one of the things they were most worried about, which turned out not to be true, but in the old data they thought it was the missile gap. And so they feed this back to Deirdre, who feeds it back to Kennedy and the Brain Trust. And it's one of the things that Kennedy runs on, that the Nixon-Eisenhower administration find it hard to deny for national security reasons. And of course, it's one of those elements that some people say contributed to Kennedy's victory. Either way, when Kennedy comes to power, he knows all about their flexible response ideas and this counter-force idea that gives him more options in the event of nuclear war. And so he starts to bring them into his administration. Kaufman becomes an Undersecretary of Defense. So does Enthoven. Woolstatter believes he has more power on the outside, and so they're kind of like his puppets in the halls of power. And you start to get a whole new positioning of American nuclear strategy. And if you're going to create a new nuclear strategy that relies on counterforce, so being more precise with nuclear weapons, then what do you need to do? You need to invest in those precision technologies that allow it to happen. And that's instrumental to our history, because it's those nuclear technologies and those nuclear missiles, those delivery devices, that then lead us through to conventional precision missiles that drive us through the RMA and bring us back through to that point in the 1990s, where eventually precision missiles are coupled with drone technologies, and we have the world of precision missiles and drones that we see today. And it's here. From around 1988 onwards, it's Albert Woolstatter and Freda Clay. That's Albert and Roberta towards the later years of their life. Or as one student told me, it looks like a retirement photo. But they say that thanks to the advances in computer data gathering and transmission, missile range and yield, and offensive accuracies and reliability, precision missiles could provide an effective discriminate deterrence through conventional missile technologies. Now, let me go into a little bit detail about this, because it's quite fascinating for our story. So what Albert Woolstatter starts to argue in 1988, when he releases his report, one of his final report, he dies in the early 90s, is he argues that due to all of these advancements in precision technologies, we've now reached a point where we don't even have to use the nuclear option should the Soviet Union start to flex its muscles. Instead, due to the accuracy of these precision missile technologies and the high yield conventional warheads, and the fact that if you have accuracy plus high yield, you only need to send a few or one or two of these missiles to hit silos in the Soviet Union, then you don't have to resort to the nuclear option anymore. And so he's giving us a way out from having only the reliance on a nuclear response. To give you some details here in terms of how this outlines in the report, it was stated that accurate, smart, conventional weapons can make a major contribution to halting Soviet attacks anywhere in the world on the parameter of the USSR. That these weapons can delay and inflict heavy losses on advancing forces by delivering firepower on critical targets that can make breakthroughs difficult for invading troops and give time for defenses to be deployed. And the report concludes, by standards of a decade ago, the accuracies are extraordinary. Current technologies make it possible to attack fixed targets at any range with accuracies of 1 to 3 meters. And of course, there is no doubt that he is correct in terms of how these end up impacting American warfare and its reliance on precision missile technologies and later drones. But there's a really interesting warning at the end of this report in 1988. High tech is not an American monopoly. He warns about how China will be able to develop these weapons in the future. He also puts a number of Middle Eastern and North African countries on that list. But he worries that one day these weapons will be used against the United States. And so this brings us back to our history here today and what I study. That deviation from those original progressive, moral, ethical ideas of avoiding civilians and providing that advantage for the United States, back round to this point where these precision weapons are amongst the greatest threats to state security. Thank you all very much.
First of all, thank you for talking here. There was a great lecture. My question is, you talked a lot about the dangers and essentially the destruction that can be caused by drone technologies and precision drones. But my question is there any effective way to counter drones, especially like precision drones that are that are much more accurate than, I guess, regular drone technology would be?
Yeah. If I could answer that question, I think I'd be making a lot of money right now. So if anyone has the answer, keep hold of it. Look, there are lots of ways being deployed right now that take drones out of the sky. right? But for me, I feel like due to the fact that we have neglected air defense for at least 2 generations, we are always one step behind right now when it comes to drone systems. Also, the air defense systems that we do have been set up either for high altitude incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? Or they've been set up for stopping cheap mortars and artillery being fired at forward operating bases, for example, or perhaps cities, as with the Iron Dome. You know, the Iron Dome is the most advanced advanced air defense system in the world. Let's not get it confused. It's not a counter-drone system because it's all about denying those kind of basic linear trajectory rockets and mortars that are fired and missiles that are fired at Israel. That lets in between 10 and maybe 15% of just those that are sent in. It has a major drone problem right now because the drones are sent in below the radar or a much lower altitude, especially those deployed by violent non-state actor groups. They're more improvised. They're made of kind of a carbon fiber composite. They can all have very different signatures depending on what they're made of. They have a very low electronic signature, that's for sure. And so there is an ability for violent non-state actor groups now to be incredibly innovative, incredibly quickly, and to evade those counter technologies. And so right now we are behind on that. And I worry that, I say that drones right now, the current generation of drone technologies, we've reached a point where we have the uncontrolled proliferation of drones. I think with the access to commercial autonomous technologies as well, you're going to have these drones that can evade air defense systems. And if you have multiples of drones, not ones and twos, but I'm talking about maybe 10s, 20s, 100 at a time that are able to evade air defense systems, it's just becomes so much harder to counter these. So no, there are no clear answers to this yet. And I think any serving military in the room would probably agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So sort of at the start of your presentation, you mentioned that drones mean that like they guarantee destruction on the receiving end of them. Yeah. And so sort of when I'm thinking about like war in itself and how like drones like remove the sort of like human aspect of it and prevent like damage to ourselves, like essentially in full. I was wondering what you think about like the ethics of this in terms of like, I think like a fundamental quality of war is like sort of like the mutually like assured risk, like the reciprocity of it, like that we both are like at stake and our lives are at stake. And so in situations where it's sort of like an asymmetrical like level of risk, like whether that like undermines like what like war being like allowed or moral at all.
So if I get your question correctly, with the spread of drones in what we traditionally called asymmetric warfare, might it lead to more chance of risk to American military lives? And so removing that idea that drones were moral and ethical and avoided the costs to American military lives, instead in the future, we might see far more costly conflicts as a result of this proliferation?
I mean, that's like... I guess that's like not like exactly what I was thinking. Like, so like obviously there's like an incredible advantage in the sense that it like preserves American lives. Like we don't necessarily need to send men on like to like actually go risk their lives. You can, do it from a distance. But then we engage with countries that maybe have less sophisticated like drone setups or maybe none at all compared to us. And then what that means in terms of like, it's such an asymmetrical situation where we avoid complete risk.
Oh, I see.
And then...
I think I get you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, nice. Does it make war too easy? Well, there is the arguments from the 1990s, people like Michael Ignatieff, who said that it makes war a turkey shoot, right, for the United States and its allies that deploy these weapon systems. And so there's the argument that when war has a component of your civilians being at risk, or those who are enlisted into the military, or those who are active service military who have civilians back home, then the public have a say, the democracies have a say, right? And they can pressure politicians if too many people are killed in those wars. When wars are waged in your name but at distance without risk to US citizens, right, then perhaps you don't have the same checks and balances in the system. And instead of maybe looking for diplomatic routes, you might go for military options instead. So that was a big debate through the 90s and certainly in the Obama era, right, that war became too easy. And I think that Obama would agree with that himself today. I've seen interviews where he states that war became seemingly odorless during this period. He'd argue that he became really good at killing, right, which is something that you perhaps wouldn't associate with Obama. Maybe you would, but he's certainly gone down in history as the first drone president within our literature. Today, I don't think that's so much of the case. I mean, these drones have come back to knock on the door and to haunt us, as they were always going to. All weapons proliferate, right? And they don't provide that revolutionary advantage that they once did for America when it had the monopoly over these systems. Look at the war in Ukraine. There's so many reports right now on this is a transformatory capability, a revolutionary capability for Ukraine in helping it win the war. No one has won that war. It's become a brutal stalemate, an attritional conflict, trench warfare with drones over the top, not only hunting down individuals with FPV tactical drone systems, but also the longer range drone systems that are each side pummeling each other. So they've added another brutal layer to conflicts, and all those promises about drones delivering these pinpoint precision and saving civilian lives certainly haven't come true. And so I think in the future, actually, we're going to have to be far more careful about where we deploy force around the world, because you can't have this remote warfare operandi that we've put forward post Afghanistan and Iraq, where we've sought to have small lily pad bases around the world, where you have small detachments of maybe special operations forces or your drones that are deployed from there, your training forces that deploy local forces that do the fighting for you. If you can't protect those lily pad bases and those small detachments, then you're going to have a really kind of overwhelming increase in the amount of casualties. And you have to change the way that you've been deploying war for the last 10, 15 years. And we haven't figured out what that's going to look like yet. So in the meantime, what that's going to mean, and of course we had, the last time that a member of the US military was killed by hostile enemy air power was 1953 during the Korean War? You'd probably know more about that than me. But that changed in January this year, when 3 members of the US military were killed at Tower 22 by a hostile enemy drone strike in Jordan by the border with Syria. And so I think that we're entering where we used to say we were in an age of bloodless warfare and perfect warfare with Kosovo and beyond, perhaps we're in the age of a renewed age of blooded warfare and more cost coming back to us. And so far more careful about where we deploy force around the world.
Thank you.
Hope that answered your question in some way.
Hi, over here. First of all, thank you for a great talk. My question is probably a popular one in the current age, but
an awkward one?
What?
An awkward question?
No, a popular one.
A popular one. Okay,
yeah.
all right.
AI is all the rave in terms of defense, and the U.S. Air Force is putting a ton of R&D and already has kind of operational
for sure
AI drones. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how that would affect maybe a new age of drone warfare, precision, what you kind of see AI's impact in drone warfare being.
So we are already seeing the deployment of AI-infused powered drones in conflict, whether that be in Ukraine with the Saka Scout or the reported use of the Kargu 2 by Turkey during the second Libyan civil war. Drones that have a preset algorithm and preset targets on board. The Saka Scout is said to be able to identify 65 different preset military targets and to take that strike without a human being in the loop of control. So it's argued that we've already reached the point where a machine will decide whether or not a human lives or dies. I think that is a line that we should not cross, although we already have. It's a line that state actors who seek to set red lines and norms in the international system should not cross. What's interesting is where do you draw the acceptable use, right? And that in the current debates is around appropriate or meaningful human control. But what does that look like? And these are where the debates sit right now. There's some of those, you can look at the work of people like TX Hammers, who argue that it is our moral imperative to adopt AI into our militaries and autonomous weapons because they help reduce human error by delegating this over to machines. And they can also help mitigate human error as well. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps if you had AI-guided target acquisition, AI-enhanced strikes that help augment the human experience with a human having the final say about which target is hit, maybe that is possible. Who knows? I would argue from my work that in the end, when it comes down to a period of supreme emergency, those rules seem to go out the window, and those precision technologies we had in place to protect civilians appear to conveniently be used to cause mass destruction where possible. And so I see a future where we have lethal autonomous weapon systems, and you might have, now if you've got a Sky Guardian, which is like the latest iteration of the Predator drone, you might have 4 to, maximum maybe 7 people if it's a high profile mission. I mean, you could even have the president in the room making the decisions for these drone systems, right? About when that precision strike is going to be released on a target. So it's a human intensive process right now. In the future, at a time of supreme emergency in war, I see you might have 100 drones over the zone of warfare, or perhaps at different points around the world. You might have one human operator at a ground control station somewhere, or maybe located back in the continental United States. They are monitoring these drones, but these drones have a human outside of the loop of control. So they have authorization to strike when they need to, because you need to do it quickly, right, against your enemy, because your enemy are likely using these systems as well, quicker than a human can make the decision and to think. And then the first time a human gets to see that is a receipt from that drone about whether or not that strike, what happened with that strike, and a human will decide whether or not that strike was justified or not. I worry that in the future war, that won't even be checked itself. So I think that is where we're going, and without any sort of international law or international control around this, then that's certainly where we're going in the future. Although Biden and Xi, when they met in San Francisco, said that they will make sure that we have a world where that doesn't take place. So do you feel heartened? I'm not sure. Okay.
Yes, thank you again for coming and talking to us at breakfast yesterday, and for giving this talk as well.
My pleasure.
So in a world where so many countries and non-state groups are able to acquire drones and drone technologies, as you put this yesterday, it's sort of the end of the beginning of this new age. Do you think the art of war or the science of war is going to be more important to national security moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would like to say both. Is that a cop-out? That's probably a cop-out, right? Yeah, but surely it has to be both. The technology of war is going to be absolutely vital to trying to keep up with countering these systems. And then, like I say, the art of war, when it comes down to how we're going to deploy new strategies in the face of these technologies, strategic revolutionary thought and new tactics are going to be absolutely key to making sure that we remain competitive on the battlefield and win these wars. So we need to invest in both, much like they did at the RAND Corporation back in 1946.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. Throughout the course of the Ukraine conflict, we've seen naval drones been used to great effect in disabling Russia's Black Sea Fleet. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the impact of drones and other precision warfare developments on the deployment of U.S. naval forces, and how do you believe that might impact the deployment of high-value U.S. naval assets like aircraft carriers, notably? Do you believe that this is making the role of carriers obsolete, or just getting your thoughts on that?
Oh, completely obsolete. No, I'm joking. No. Yeah, there are some who argue that, right? You're not going to have aircraft carriers anymore, and probably not tanks as well. Everyone should just fight with drones and maybe have small, uncrewed maritime systems as well on the sea. But as Professor Johnson and I were talking about earlier today, that has been the debate since the mid to late 1800s in French military doctrine as well. You don't have to have the big navies, you have the smaller swarming systems, right? And now they'll replace the big ticket items. I would actually see the converse in terms of what I've seen more empirically in the international system at this moment in time. What is it that is providing that drone shield for Israel, as the Iron Dome doesn't seem to be fit for purpose against drones? It is US, French, and British naval assets that are shooting the drones out of the sky. We've also just seen the first testing, although they won't release the data on it, the first testing of a US aircraft carrier using the high-intensity lasers to take the drones out of the sky as well. And so the power that comes with that, and being able to deploy in those strategically important regions to take out those longer-range weapon systems, I think there's certainly a future for those. Yeah, those in the Navy can breathe a sigh of relief.
Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for taking the time. I was curious if outside the American case, counterforce nuclear targeting is still the technological ancestor to drone technology?
No, so it's a really good question. Yes and no. So, I mean, yes, in terms of those who took the technology from the United States can trace all the way back to these same ancestors, right? That's how it works when you steal military technology. So, you know, China's Winglong 2 is a carbon copy of a Predator. And some of the elements of the Bayraktar industries come directly from the United States, including the young, talented researcher from MIT that was brought in by Erdogan to make that entire drone industry. But, you know, say, for example, those who've been working a little bit longer on this, like Iran, well, they can be traced back to more like the early 1980s and really 1980 itself. So with the Iranian Revolution, Iran had a lot of big ticket items that had been supplied by the Brits and the Americans that had maintenance contracts with the Brits and the Americans that could no longer be fulfilled. That and a few pilots had defected in the meantime as well in their fighter aircraft. And Iran didn't have much time to stand on its laurels. It had to innovate quickly, especially with Saddam Hussein and the Iran-Iraq War. And so they start to really rely on trying to create conventional precision missile technologies to aid them in that conflict that then leads through to their drone capabilities. Where does that come from? It comes from cooperation with North Korea and being sent some of their medium-range ballistic missile technologies, and also with China as well. So you can trace it back to the same sort of delivery systems. And that's why Iran has such a useful drone program for them today, and how they're able to supply those to the axis of resistance across the Middle East. They've really built up since the 1980s a robust supply chain that's been pretty hard to break. These are cheap systems as well. And so that's how they've been able to do it. But really good question.
Hi. So you've talked about your research about precision strikes, mostly for the use of drones. I was wondering if you've looked at your research has looked at the use of drones in surveillance at all, if you see any future applications for that.
Yeah. One of my key areas of interest right now is the Arctic, especially as Putin threatens that it will be a kind of release valve. Right now, today and yesterday, with Biden allowing Ukraine to fire long-range precision missiles against Russia, Putin has said for a while that it will be in the Arctic that he seeks to flex his muscles and his superior military power up in that region. Now, we've known that for a little while. And so what have Western European Arctic nations been investing in? Well, they've been investing in medium altitude, long endurance, and high altitude drone technologies. So these are Sky Guardians and also Global Hawks as well. Now, these are unarmed systems at this moment in time, and their whole purpose is for surveillance and reconnaissance. They're particularly, in the case of Denmark, deployed up in Aalborg, which is kind of north of the Northern Sea Route and at the bottom end of at the top end of the North Sea and at the bottom end of the Northern Sea Route on the kind of precipice of going into the Arctic waters, right? For Norway, it's actually in their further northern territories where they're deploying Global Hawk systems that they're seeking to acquire. Again, surveying that area of the Northern Sea Route where Russia and Chinese vessels have been seeing come through, and there's been increases in submarine activity as well in the UK, Greenland, Iceland gap. Iceland have acquired Hermes 900 Israeli medium altitude long endurance drones. Again, they're not armed. They're there to surveil those further reaches. And the British have acquired Sky Guardians that they'll deploy from the north of Scotland in Lossiemouth to do the same thing. So there's an interoperability from that edge of Europe down and out to the Arctic. And a lot of people have given Denmark specifically a lot of flack for positioning their drones in somewhere like Aalborg and not in their territories in Greenland, although it looks like they might have them as well. But I see it as building a kind of drone surveillance wall in between the Baltic and the Arctic, allowing them to surveil both domains when necessary. And that isn't about escalating tensions. That's about trying to make sure you have the right information and you're able to react in a timely manner when needed and things aren't misconstrued and escalated inappropriately. These I can't see being armed systems, especially when you have up to 75% of Russia's nuclear deterrence posture up in the Arctic as well. For Russia, it could be seen as a major escalation. Could they be able to spy on exactly where those nuclear capabilities are? It certainly could be the rhetoric. So there are some dangers of a security dilemma and escalation there. But for the NATO-affiliated powers and the European Arctic states, it's certainly seen as a way to try and manage those escalating tensions through unarmed surveillance drones.
Thank you very much. In your read ahead, you mentioned a couple examples of drone warfare, particularly the Obama administration basically using it as a means to for more precision killings, as well as President Trump using it on Soleimani. So at least to me, it seems that there is kind of higher reliance on drone warfare. So I was wondering about your thoughts on how there could be legislative reforms about it moving forward. How potentially Congress could potentially reform it, if there's been conversations on it, to kind of place more restraint on it so that it's not too one-sided in that approach.
Yeah, I think you raised the Soleimani killing. I think that was a bit of a threshold moment for the reputation of the United States and how it uses drones. I mean, that was no doubt Soleimani was not a nice person, right? And actually, he was integral to supplying the axis of resistance with Iranian drone technologies. So there's many reasons why that person was killed. But under international law, you can't kill somebody for something that they've done. It's all about preemptive self-defense, so you kill them for something they're going to do. And the Trump administration never released that information that he was killed for something that he was planning or going to do. So under international law, it was illegal. There's also another couple of problems there. They just redesignated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. That's a state organization. So that meant that that state actor was deemed a terrorist actor. And what that led to is a justification of killing a state actor for the first time by a drone. So we can call it an assassination if we want to. In a third-party country that didn't give permission for the US to kill that actor in their country. So that's Iraq, right? So we violated the sovereignty of Iraq to kill a state actor via a drone strike in a drone assassination. That really reduced some international norms there, yeah? And it worries me a lot in terms of a new age of assassinations from these new drone actors in the future. Could Congress come in to bring in new controls? I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen over the next 4 years, because under the Trump administration, what happened was he broadened and widened the criteria under which drone strikes could take place. So outside zones of active conflict under the Obama administration, there had to be almost near certainty of zero civilian casualties. But under the Trump administration, that was redefined as you could kill a high-profile target and their entourage, right? Now, you define an entourage for me, because it sounds rather politically loaded to me, right? Henchmen standing around a terrorist actor. Ends up being granddad, grandma, and kids and everything else. So that allowed far more drone strikes and far more civilian casualties. Under the Biden administration, there were more controls brought in place. Jake Sullivan led a review into this, and they were trying to bring it more in line with some of the later policies of the Obama administration, where he sought to rectify some of those older wrongs. If the Trump administration seeks to continue focusing on drones into the future as a spearhead of American force deployment, then I can only imagine that you move back towards more of a broader targeting justification system. Yeah.
You have a question on the way back?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, thank you for your talk, by the way. With the kind of the shifting of the drone industry more so towards like Turkey and China and like Iran, what actions do you think the United States needs to take to remain technologically competitive? Should the MTCR be abandoned to a certain extent? And then overall, like more generally, do you think the drone market will shift away from medium altitude long endurance drones and high altitude long endurance drones more so towards smaller, low cost loitering munitions?
MTCR has already largely been abandoned, right? To be fair, on the Trump administration, it was holding the US back in its drone sales during a time when those who weren't party to the MTCR were just filling the place of the US, right? And that became a real vulnerability when you started to have Iraq buying Chinese drones. And so you had Chinese training operatives on sharing bases with US military personnel who were training the Iraqis how to use them and potentially maybe hoovering up some data at the same time and learning some things. So it became a security vulnerability at the same time. And also they were losing out on the arms sales to key allies and maybe damaging their reputation with those key allies. You know, Erdogan was turned down 3 times by Congress in its sale of drones due to the MTCR. And the whole point of that was that drones were classified as being potential delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction. So the Trump administration redefined that ever so slightly whilst trying to keep some of the core tenets of the MTCR in place. So that doesn't control drones anymore, and there's nothing that controls the sale of drones out there. Do I think that means that the US is going to lose its place as the most advanced and innovative drone actor in the world? No, not at all. It's so much more advanced, even when it comes down to the Chinese and the Turkish systems as well, at a medium altitude, long endurance and kind of strategic level. The problem comes in at the tactical level, right? Because it's China that really innovated in this area. Diong Industries, DJI, is a Chinese manufacturer that managed to have a number of systems placed within various departments of the US government until it was found out that those systems may or may not be reporting directly back to Beijing. And so the US is now playing catch up in trying to build its drone industry in the commercial area. And obviously, it's behind in that. And also to have the related industry of making the components for that drone industry, which it also appears to be behind on. Ukraine continues to rely on Chinese components as well. You know, it brought up this, when China said it was going to stop Ukraine being able to buy the DJI Mavic family of drones, Ukraine bought up 60% of the world's market of those systems, which they then cannibalize to make their kind of more artisan drone systems work, right? Because DJI systems, you figured out how to hack those, so they use the components. So at one level, the US will maintain dominance. At the other, when it comes down to these more disposable tactical systems, I think it's more difficult. But that's why you've had the investment in the replicator program, where the US is looking to really kind of, I guess, skip that generation and move towards more fully autonomous weapon systems. Yeah.
I'd like to take advantage of my prerogative as moderator and ask you a historical question here.
Okay.
Obviously, great interest in the contemporary implications, but going back to the history. So one of the pivot moments in your book and in your talk today is obviously the atomic revolution, the bombing of Hiroshima. It seems as if the Hiroshima could have been used as evidence by both the precision school and the overkill school to some degree. LeMay obviously drawing from it, but the precision school indicating, you know, they're using precision pilots, they're using these systems. Yeah. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that moment and how it was interpreted and how it was used in this debate during the Cold War?
Yeah. The history for the justifications, the reasons why the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki comes up with a wide-ranging tapestry of motivations of why that bomb was dropped, right, or why both bombs were dropped. It was to deter the Soviets. It was to make sure that the United States could ensure Japanese surrender so it would have full control over the entire Japanese homeland and how it would be rebuilt. There were elements of racism that contributed towards this. Would the bomb have been dropped on Germany if it had been ready in time? And a whole litany of other reasons. Maybe we needed just to make sure it worked, seeing as they spent $2.2 billion on it and had to justify that to the taxpayer as well. Or maybe there was military necessity. There is, in the book, I highlight another reason. When you look at LeMay's rolling bombardment of the Japanese, and you look at 180,000 dead in one attack, and you have this trajectory towards bombing every major Japanese city and destroying that population, there is those, especially certain politicians, you look at the writings of Stimson and maybe Truman as well, although his diaries have been doctored a bit, so we aren't entirely sure what he thought at the time, but there's certainly those in the US Air Force who are thinking, well, if we can end this war super quickly, then we're going to avoid that broader destruction. Of course, we'll avoid Operation Downfall as well, and maybe a million dead on each side. And so is the dropping of these atomic bombs more proportionate, more discriminate comparatively to the other options that are put before us, whether that be an air power strategy or whether that be a ground invasion, or perhaps both at the same time? And so that is why they choose Tibbets to drop the bomb. That is why he's told that you must return if you cannot drop this visually with the Norden bomb sight, instead of using the more imprecise early radar systems to help drop the bombs right through the clouds. That is why you secure that level of precision on the target. Did they think that the bombs were going to be as destructive as they were? Many nuclear historians have written about that as well, that they were many times the destructive capacity they thought they were going to be. There was certainly a rhetoric property to it, if we wanted to be more cynical, because when Truman comes to justifying those bombings, and you look at the speeches he makes to the American people, remember, from very early on, the American people have subscribed to the US being a more moral actor to the brutal Europeans, because you deploy precision bombing. That's what you do. You avoid the civilians and their populace, and you hit military targets. So what are some of the first words that comes out of Truman's mouth? Hiroshima, we hit a military target. And they do, with the Second Army base in Hiroshima. Just so happens that that's where the local market is, that's where the entire kind of civilian base is as well, and you have 100,000 dead in that attack, up to 120,000 dead in that attack. So there is a political rhetoric property of being able to say, we hit a military target with precision, and then perhaps less suspiciously, more sincerely, there was a military ambition to try and bring the war to an end quickly, and this could have been a comparatively more proportionate and discriminate attack. But that's a highly controversial thing to say, because we know the end result.
Hi there. Thanks again for a great talk. It's obviously stirred up the crowd. I just want to push back a little bit. You seem like a prophet of doom. We're entering this age of where drones are going to wreak havoc everywhere. And I can certainly see lots of scenarios where you could have a drone in Times Square, all sorts of things that are unexpected.
I didn't say that, but yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing that could really shock the public. On the other hand, if you were in Ukraine, would you rather have 1,000 B-17s over you or be attacked by a bunch of drones? And so what kind of argument can you make that things really are as bad as you think they might be? Because I just don't see the tonnage of explosives being anywhere near what they were in the past and what they were in Vietnam. 3 times the amount of explosive power than in all of World War II. So I just want you to elaborate on your case, see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the case study that we're studying. You're absolutely right. And I mean, I'm not sure I would say that the 2 options that are before us are the B-17s or the drones, right? I do think that when it comes down to those en masse deployments of Shahed 131s and 136s, if you're sat under those, it's still very destructive and very frightening, and also a large amount of civilian casualties as well. And you just look at the destruction and the en masse destruction of many cities across Ukraine. So especially when those weapons have been used to target civilian targets and to destroy civilian centers, there isn't as much difference as we might think if you're sat there in Ukraine. But I do take your point, and I think for me, as opposed to it being this risk of the destruction of cities en masse in the future, like you would have with an area bombing campaign, I don't see that you'll have area bombings with drones, although we kind of have seen it a little bit in Ukraine. I don't think that's going to be the defining feature of this. Instead, it's American military forces deployed abroad right now who are super vulnerable to this and to this precision strike capability and the lack of air defense systems to be able to counter against them. And so for me, one of the big worries is how the US then continues to project its power in regions it deems to be incredibly strategic important when it doesn't have the capabilities to counter this, or the costs of war start to increase. And that can also be taken for key strategic choke points in the international system as well, and how vulnerable they are to being crippled by these precision technologies. So these can include, moving through the Red Sea and into the Suez Canal. And we're seeing that a violent non-state actor group with Houthi rebels in that region are able to really degrade the ability of civilian maritime traffic to move through that area, whether that be through humanitarian aid or with consumer goods driving up the prices back home, and what that could mean for future security and stability in the international system and US interests in that area. So they're the things I think that worry me more than perhaps a Times Square bombing with drones, although, I mean, you mention it. I mean, next generation intercontinental range drone systems worry me as well, and the Iran stating to Venezuela and Bolivia in agreements to build Shahed factories in those countries, and Argentina having to counter that by signing deals with Israel to start building drones in Argentina. You are starting to see the proliferation of these medium to longer range systems on the American continent as well.
So you're kind of implying we're moving into a more offense-dominant world in a way that's going to make our forces more vulnerable, hurt extended deterrence, conventional extended deterrence. So wouldn't the next step be to try and shift it back to a defensive dominant world? And how would you envision doing that?
Yeah, I don't have those answers yet, but I do think that might be the case, where we become far more controlled about where we deploy force and the wars in which we fight due to the cost of those wars. And perhaps that's something we will start to see in a second Trump administration, when we have quite public pronouncements of more of an isolationist stance for the United States. And maybe that could be seen as being in reaction to some of the drone threats that are out there in the world, as alongside, of course, major political motivations as well.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, thank you.
One there as well, I think.
Thank you for the presentation. I just want to follow up on this question of racism and World War II, especially in terms of precision bombing and area bombing. So I'm really interested in questions of racism and great power politics. So I'm a big believer in the John Dower thesis regarding that racism was a powerful force and the way the war was conducted between Japan and the United States. So in the first part, I want to ask, how much of that, and you can refer me to your book if you discuss this there, how much did racism affect that shift between going from precision bombing to adopting an aerial bombing strategy? So that's the first thing. And, this is going to be a bit more bounded in terms of your previous answer regarding that, the decision to use nuclear weapons, at the end of the war. I mean, I don't believe that this was guided by racism. I think this was purely strategic concerns. But I guess I wonder, how do we reconcile those two views? Like, if we accept the premise, and we don't have to, that racism possibly led to, a more acceptance of annihilating the Japanese on the front end, how is that reconciled with this view that actually we want to limit the death on the back end when we come to the decision to use atomic weapons? How do you think about those two things? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's one major contributing factor that drives the decision to drop the atomic bomb. I do think that depending on who you speak to is involved in that process, that each person's going to have different motives that drive that. I mean, even when it comes to drone warfare today, there's discussions about whether or not post 9/11, and as the war on terror goes on, that drones are dehumanizing and it just so happens that, of course, the people that they target, there is an element of perhaps revenge tied into that as well. There's whole movements of not a bug splat, making entire fields with pictures of children that have been killed by drone strikes so that drone pilots can see who it is that they have killed. Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu, likened the Obama administration's drone policy to apartheid in how it protected American life and completely disregarded those abroad. So there are these elements in there. It is not the core focus of my work. What I will say about potentially personal motivations, although again this could be deemed to be controversial, is that post his military time in office, LeMay runs as George Wallace's vice president on a segregation ticket. Maybe that answers your question. I'm not sure.
Me? Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think this is a really interesting topic. I just had a question in your response to Professor Lindley's question. You talked about the offense-defense balance and whether or not that's shifting back to the offense with the emergence of drones.
Yeah.
And how that kind of ties into the Trump administration's somewhere between restraint and isolationist approach to foreign policy. Yeah. Would the shift to, and maybe I misunderstood, so correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't the shift to a world where the offense is favored kind of lead to less a more proactive approach rather than restraint and isolationism as the Trump I guess administration has hinted at in their approach, or do you think that like the offense-defense balance is still in favor of the defense because of nuclear weapons are still a factor? I guess I just was wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into that.
I'm sure the responsible people appointed in the Trump administration will make responsible decisions about the future of that force deployment. I mean, do I worry that with the proliferation of drones that you could perhaps see some quite damaging attacks take place against either US military or diplomatic sites and US allies that draws the United States into conflict? Potentially. It depends how much the Trump administration is committed to that isolationist response and what it's willing to do to withstand that. I do think that where we're seeing a lot of these drone strikes taking place, of course, is in the Middle East, which is somewhere that the Trump administration appears to want to get more involved in. I think if you do have more US military assets and troops deployed into that area, you will see an increased risk to those assets and military lives and an increased cost to those military lives.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question.
Maybe one more question.
I think we've covered the entirety of drones, which is a rarity, but I think we've done it. Comprehensive analysis.
Is that a rack of drones on the left?
Yeah. They're the Shaheds. Yeah, so they're truck launched usually and mobile, super mobile. So it makes it even harder to find out where they are and to counter them from launch. And they're sent all at once in their multiples to saturate those targets as well. Yeah. I did have another slide as well, I think. But I thought everyone thought I might have
yeah, that's fine.
droned on just a little bit. I only used that joke once because it's the only one I can get away with. But yeah, I think we've touched on most of the points there as well. And then there's just a bit of further reading there if anyone's interested. A couple of pieces written recently. And then if anyone is interested in the book as well, you can use the code EVENT30, not Warfare30, to get 30% off, which is about $30. So it's not too much. Or you can probably access it for free through the library, actually, I think, yeah. So don't bother buying it, just read it for free if you want to.
I wanted to explore a bit more the question on the net effects of drones. And this is obviously a very hard empirical question, but I was just wondering what your intuition is here. Because on the one hand, you could very easily argue that drones decrease the amount of deaths in war because the strikes are much more precise. But on the other hand, you could argue that several of these strikes would not happen if they were not to be that precise. And so you could argue for an increase in the amount of deaths in war. And this is important because one there's the obvious ethical question. All else equal, we want fewer deaths in war. We don't want to blow up grandma and a bunch of kids in a wedding or something. But also because it changes how we talk about war. Many people argue that war is on the decline because we see fewer battle deaths nowadays. And some people have argued that this is because medicine got better and other factors. It has nothing to do with war being less prevalent or anything. And so drones might have this impact if this hypothesis is true. So do you have a sense of whether people use strikes more freely, if leaders use strikes more freely if they have drones, if it is a net increase or a net decrease in the amount of deaths that we see in the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, let's move away from the US example because that's been discussed kind of until the end of time. And no one's come to a clear answer about whether or not they encourage strikes in war, whether or not we see war as being too easy. We see war as that surgical scalpel, and it's not what it always is, which is a bloodstained sword, like Ignatieff would argue, and move towards how they're being used by other state actors around the world who don't prescribe to at least trying to fulfill some bounds of international law, trying to keep in line with just war theory, trying to be building off that precision ethos that's enshrined the US Air Force kind of way of war since its origins. And let's look at other actors. And it's there that I believe that drones do truly equal destruction, and they provide nation states that have not been able to have a potent air power capability to have that for the first time, and a cheaper air power capability that allows them to deploy force over thousands of kilometers across terrain that is much harder for their militaries to be able to maneuver across, and to attack groups, whether they be militant groups or defined as militant groups or rebel groups, but also to certain civilian groups as well, like I say, ethnic groups or religious groups that aren't in line with the government in charge. And so we are now seeing, 100% seeing, how these drones are enabling these nation states to deploy forces in regions that it had been much harder to do so, and to deploy force against civilians. And so, like I said at the beginning, I do see a future, and I put it in the slide here, where we have a major issue with drone mass killings and kind of drones being used for genocides as well.
Well, on that very happy note,
finish on that. Yeah, exactly.
Please join me in thanking Professor Rogers.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.